So Operation Sea Spray.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about Operation Sea Spray, which at this point in my life, I'm not terribly shocked that the government is capable and willing to do pretty terrible things to their own people in the name of quote-unquote science. But
just crazy things.
Yeah. We'll talk about a couple other examples, but I think people are pretty broadly aware of a couple of examples throughout history. But
I've never heard of this one, though.
Yeah, this one kind of flew under the radar for me, too. I hadn't heard about it. I guess to give you some context as to why I stumbled onto it, actually, kind of leads into, as often is the case, things that are currently in the media or in the news sphere. Maybe I'll get into this a little bit later, but there was something that happened fairly recently that you and I think, discussed offline a little bit that I thought was kind of intriguing. More so, not because of it itself, but the fact that it hadn't got more attention.
The bacteria or the...
This is more like...
the recall stuff?
This had to do with like the fact that as of December 4th, which was only about a month ago, there was a little bit more attention being put towards the COVID lab leak theory.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Where various people and organizations within the government more or less admitted that they have a large amount of evidence and reason to believe that that wasn't conspiratorial at all. And that, in fact, COVID, which we're coming out of, a extended, prolonged pandemic, and COVID will itself probably never go away, was very likely released from the Wuhan lab in China, where they were doing gain-of-function research. And,
Is this Robert Redfield?
Robert Redfield, the CDC.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the news. It's from Newsweek. I see something from December 28th.
So, on top of that, Robert Redfield came out and basically said he had those suspicions.
Former director of the U.S. CDC.
Yep. He said he's done interviews with the BBC and other places that I had heard, and he's had those suspicions for a long time, but, due to the political climate...
said that it's possible.
Said it's possible. Well, there's actually also, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but there was also a committee review from the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress that came to similar conclusions. 520 pages that I started to read just to see what they came up with, and that was pretty interesting. I have a few notes here that maybe we can talk about later, just as it pertains to kind of the general idea that we're discussing with Operation Sea Spray, which is that the government has at multiple times throughout its recent history actually been a proponent for researching biological agents and how they can affect large populations, both for understanding epidemiology, but also how they could be implemented for use as a weapon.
Right. See the effects. So let's get into sea spray.
Yeah, so sea spray in itself actually occurred back in the 1950s. So this was a U.S. naval experiment conducted in 1950 off of the coast of California, in particular San Francisco area. Essentially involved members of the Navy releasing intentionally multiple types of bacteria. The two big ones, one was called Serratia marcescens. I'm not sure that I'm even coming close to pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The other one is called Bacillus globigii. So both of these at that time were presumed to be fairly harmless, inert bacterial species. And so really what they were trying to gauge was, if we release this into the open air, we want to try to track where infections might end up.
Yeah, seems good on paper.
Yeah, and they're like, we might be able to track it epidemiologically. People may get infected, but there more or less there are other tracers that they're actually looking for. They weren't actually expecting much to come of it in terms of like human infection or downstream casualties or anything like that. But nonetheless, it poses an inherently disturbing willingness to try something like that. Obviously, you know, from an ethical standpoint, when typically in the modern era, when we're doing experimentation amongst the public, you have to have consent.
Right.
People have to know that they're being experimented on. Well, this isn't the only case, but the government has multiple times over avoided getting proper consent from the public. I mean, if you're spraying them down with bacteria unknowingly, it's kind of not cool. In any case, this was aimed to study the potential vulnerability of the U.S. to biological warfare attacks from foreign adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union at the time, midst of the Cold War, or even downstream things like China and other potentials. So these experiments were part of a broader series of secret biological warfare tests conducted during the Cold War. It wasn't limited. There was ones before this, actually, as I found out later in my research. And, well, not surprisingly, there was ones after it, too, and we'll get to that in a moment. So a couple main goals was to, again, assess airborne biological agents, how they disperse into urban environments, how they can impact populations, how they move throughout populations. This was done over a course of several days in late September of 1950. Released from ships off the coast, the Bay Area was chosen because its weather and geography allowed for an efficient tracking of the dispersal of this agent.
Did you come across anything about like the fog?
Yeah, and actually that brought up another reason why it kind of stuck in my brain, because I had a weird encounter a few weeks ago where there was this mist and people were like, what the heck is this? This is talking about sea spray. They were just like suspicious of it because it wasn't, I mean, San Francisco gets fog. This didn't apparently feel or look the same as most of the fog people were kind of familiar with. Mm-hmm. Coincidentally, about a month ago, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but I had that thought. And I lived growing up in an area in the Northwest where fog was fairly normal, you know, wetlands, lowlands, you would see fog. And fog actually, not to get too far into the science, but it can take on several different forms, right? Yeah. There's like the kind of fog where it's all encompassing, right? And you can't see anything, and it's kind of the whole area.
Freaky, yeah.
Visibility is low, particularly dangerous when driving, right? That's the kind of fog that I'm most familiar with, and even at times in Arizona, I've seen on occasion. Not as common though, because the moisture level here is a little bit lower. And then there's another kind of fog that typically kind of is more local to like right above waterways or kind of wetlands, marshes.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I find this actually fairly like scenic and pretty when you're like driving, you know, down a country road, or whatever, and you look out and you can actually see like the fog. It's just hanging
over a pond,
or a pond or a wetland, but it's not like a large pillar. It's actually probably 10 to 20 feet high, kind of in a amorphous shape, comes and goes. And that's very common where I grew up, Western Washington. It's a lot of wetland and swampy areas. I was driving back from Phoenix, and this was, again, most times when you see fog, it's usually in the morning or in the evening as temperature changes, right? Because it's typically caused by temperature change, you know, hot or cold to warm, warm to cold, that kind of deal. And but this was midday, like 5 p.m. and it was a particular area in between Phoenix where there's not a lot. There's definitely very little water, not wetland, not marshes, nothing. And I saw this like area that we're driving through that was just kind of like this low-laying fog, not all encompassing, but that kind of fog like you would expect over a marsh. And I was like, this is super weird, super out of place. I'm no expert in weather patterns, but this doesn't seem natural. Like, is it smoke? no, smoke wouldn't be so concentrated. I was like, are we driving through like this weird biological agent? Like, I don't know, weird stuff is going on in the world right now. Who knows? Yeah. I'm like, are we gonna start feeling like our face burning or whatever?
Yeah, I was hearing something about the fog. It wasn't just in Arizona either. There was multiple places where it made the news.
Yeah, and people were claiming it was like making them feel queasy, nauseous, even burning their skin. This is something that was reported, I think, in Florida and a couple other places I heard about too. So it kind of spurred that. And then I saw this story where people associated the fog kind of as this peculiar thing where they were maybe not feeling well after coming into it. So all these kind of things, I don't know, call it paranoia or whatever, but I was like,
clicking. Coincidences.
This is weird. Yeah, coincidences. But that's a big part of it. So it, like, as the name implies, sea spray, it's kind of like more or less kind of this fog was carried into the harbor in the area. Little did they know, they actually did have reason to be concerned because it was carrying bacteria within. I don't know did you see any other accounts? I didn't go too far into the personal accounts people had.
No, and there was a couple of people that got sick, and then there was one guy that did die, but it wasn't necessarily, at least from what I read, it wasn't clear that it was like 100% caused because of it. Yeah,
so essentially, when it all came down to it, the outcomes, it was successful.
They were able to...
in a way, it was successful. It said it approximately affected 117 square miles. And data was collected based on where the microorganisms were later found in the environment. And also, eventually, it was inhaled and ingested by various people, so they were able to track it that way. Believed to be harmless, right, at the time. This experiment actually showed that it might not be as harmless as people previously thought.
Especially if it's like high dose. Like.
Yeah. Well, and they actually, I think there's numbers on this, have them somewhere. It says, based on results in monitoring equipment at 43 different locations in the area, the Army later determined that San Francisco had received enough of a dose for nearly all of its 800,000 residents to inhale at least 5,000 particles of the various bacteria. This is within the range of infectivity of something like anthrax, which posed the risk that they were worried about. So
right,
anthrax,
everybody's heard of anthrax.
Yeah, anthrax being a biological agent used often as a potential bioweapon. So that's what they were kind of trying to determine, is like, would this be something we had to worry about, say if someone had released something like anthrax? And the answer is yes. To your point, people did become infected. I think 11 people in all were actually associated with infection, one of which, in fact, unfortunately, did die. Now, they said that the ones that became infected, the most common sign for infection was a urinary tract infection. They also, some of them had respiratory issues. Later, it was associated with even pneumonia, but they couldn't necessarily prove, I think you mentioned this, that it was directly linked.
Right.
The UTI, though, interestingly enough, I read anecdotes, everyone's like, UTI, what's the big deal? One of the things that tipped them off as to, like, this could be related, and how they actually, doctors began to associate or discover that something weird is awry, is because these patients, when in the hospital, they collected urine specimens, and it was like bright red, which can be a sign of different things, including like blood in the urine. But it's also this particular bacteria, the Serratia marcescens, has this like red hue associated with it. And so they cultured it, and they're like, oh, that's what this is. It's this bacteria. And they found that to be really strange because, to their knowledge, it's not native bacteria to that area. It never had
something's going on here.
Yeah, they never had an infection in the U.S. They're like, how did this happen that we got 11 cases within a week from a bacteria that we've never had an infection in the entire U.S. before. So it's very peculiar. Luckily for those people, it wasn't like they couldn't be treated. There was one person, Edward Nevin, who unfortunately died as a result of that infection.
Yeah, a Serratia infection.
Yeah.
Shortly after the experiment.
A caveat there, and I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to diminish the tragedy of a death, but apparently he, as well as some of the others that were infected, you know, they throw this term out there a lot these days, but they had, prior conditions, comorbidities. He, in fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, had recently had issues with his heart, or it was like recovering from heart surgery or something like that. I think he died of like some sort of complications to that along with the infection. So it's not to say that it's any less tragic, but these were people that were maybe a little bit more vulnerable than your general population. So that the other caveat to this whole situation is they're like, oh yeah, only affected 11 people. Well, that's probably not necessarily true. I mean, it is known to cause respiratory infection and infection now. But only 11 of them ended up in the hospital. Right. So they probably weren't tracking it at a large level amongst that population. There's probably, I'm almost certain, other people that were infected and affected, but probably not to an extreme degree, maybe not enough to warrant medical attention. Nonetheless, poor old Edward Nevin, was kind of a casualty, so to speak. So, I mean, this experiment obviously raises ethical concerns regarding the lack of informed consent to the public, as well as deliberately or inadvertently, rather, posing health risks to the public. And I guess what's even kind of stranger is, although these doctors were like, what the hell's going on? Like, this shouldn't happen. The details of that like operation weren't actually revealed for over 2 more decades.
Yeah.
So the general public, even though they went through this,
they probably didn't even have like an inkling of like, yeah, the Navy just sprayed some bacteria.
No,
that's probably not even the conspiracy theory that they were doing.
Oh, I'm sure those doctors were just like, oh my gosh, this is a new disease like emerging. They probably had some crazy ideas of how it got there. But yeah, it didn't come out until declassified disclosures were made in the 1970s, which eventually, obviously, people were kind of upset about. Now, as a result of this, for what it's worth, it may not have prevented any further real change, but at least people are aware that the government is kind of sketch sometimes.
I wonder if they learned anything to like actually try and prevent ships from releasing more dangerous toxins off San Francisco. Like, is there any preventative measures that they did or can do?
I don't know. I mean, you would like to speculate.
About that, but
the challenge here is that they basically, in terms of the disclosures, the disclosures were pretty limited. They're like, yeah, that happened, we did that. But pretty much all the other information relevant probably to what you're talking about, actual strategic assets and strategy, I don't imagine that those were ever revealed.
Not, no.
So it's possible. It's probably more than likely. Although, how
would you do that?
How do you actually control that? I mean, you got a weather machine. You got,
what are you patrol the entire ocean, the entire bay.
Yeah. So, kind of hard. Let's see. So yeah, as I mentioned, many of these affected were vulnerable due to pre-existing health conditions. It therefore made it difficult to separate the symptoms caused by the experiment versus other factors. Now, this becomes important mainly because later on, disclosure was made, people are upset. Some of the people that were infected were like, hey, that's messed up. Like, we should probably sue the government for like reparations or wrongdoing. There was a hearing actually in the 1977. There's a U.S. Senate subcommittee, which again harkens back to what I just mentioned. There's one ongoing, or actually just recently sent that report in for COVID. They held a series of hearings in which the U.S. Army disclosed the existence of these tests. Officials noted that a subsequent pneumonia outbreak that was under kind of discussion, was that related? People had thought, okay, it could be related. It is later determined that these bacteria species can cause pneumonia, so it's not completely out of the question. Although the Army argued that there couldn't be any certain link that these experiments related to that, and that they were likely coincidental. I think it's coincidental that the Army's like, yeah, nothing to see here, you know. We've heard that one before. The Army pointed out that no other hospitals reported similar outbreaks, and all 11 victims had urinary tract infections following, you know, medical procedures, suggesting that the infection probably came from the hospital, not them.
Some good lawyers.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of BS, but that's what they went with. And unfortunately for those who actually were members of the party that was suing the government, the court ruled against them, primarily because the bacteria used in the test was unproven to be the direct cause of any death or infection. It's like, well, I mean, you have a smoking gun, the fact that they never seen an infection like that before of that sort, and you had 11 people. I mean, I don't know. Lawyers be lawyering, but that's I don't know. I think cut the guy's family a little bit of a break, you know, but that's not really in their business. So they declined. The Supreme Court, it actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they declined to overturn that decision because it was not conclusive enough to be able to connect. So, I mean, long story short, government threw bacteria at San Francisco. Some people got sick. It's pretty much universally believed that it was a result of that. However, the Army refutes that and says there's no conclusive proof. It's circumstantial at best. Circumstantial, I'll give them that. It is. But, like, let's say Occam's razor, right? No previous examples of this infection, and all of a sudden you get 11 at the same hospital in one consolidated area. Seems a little fishy to me.
But you're saying that all 11 of those people had a previous surgery?
That's
kind of like, that's kind of weird.
I don't know the details on that. If they all had, that was just one of the blurbs I found, that they had all been undergoing some form of medical operation or procedure.
Because that's weird that all of them had that and they had the UTI.
I agree.
That's a coincidence.
It could be coincidental, or maybe even more than coincidental. But nonetheless, let's say they weren't all, you know, contracting it because they were outside when it happened. What if there was a downstream contamination with that same biological matter? I guess the mechanism of how they got infected is less important to me than the fact that that infection wouldn't have occurred via that mechanism at all had they not, you know, thrown this into the atmosphere. Yeah. So it's kind of like... So they were
saying that they got this super rare bacterial infection at the hospital?
That's what the Army was claiming.
That they never saw before?
That was what the Army was claiming.
Okay, that's kind of BS.
And I guess maybe, like I said, even if that's true, why does that matter? If that isn't something that could be explained in other ways, and it just so happens to be the same infectious agent that you released. In any case, so it's kind of just one more notch on the belt in a larger kind of theme of science gone wrong, sketchy science without consent, ultimately performed by, you know, the U.S. and military and other agencies. Just to kind of highlight that idea, this isn't a standalone experiment. I've looked at a couple others. Maybe we'll go into more detail later, but there's examples of this. Let's see. There's one where U.S. and U.K. military scientists, as part of what's called the DICE trials, D-I-C-E, they had a bacteria that was combined with fennel and an anthrax stimulant sprayed across South Dorset I'm not sure where Dorset actually is.
So this is like a deadly one? Is it?
I didn't read too much more into this other than it was something of note. And this was in the 1970s, 71 to 75. I don't know the outcomes. I didn't go down that rabbit hole, but this was one that came up. There was another set of experiments between 49 and 69. These were more akin to what we were just talking about with sea spray. They were open air tests conducted on 239 separate occasions. In 80 of those experiments, the Army said it used live bacteria and that its researchers at the time thought were harmless. However, they later would say that it could have been harmful. Other examples include not just biological agents, but the use of chemical agents, including 1950s Army's researchers using zinc cadmium sulfide, which is a known cancer-causing agent, dispersing it over Minnesota and other Midwestern states to see if they could spread it into the atmosphere for who knows what reasons. And the particles were detected more than 1,000 miles away up in New York State. Another example, that same Bacillus globigii, now known to be harmful to people, was released not just in San Francisco, but also New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania Turnpike to study similar types of dispersals in metropolitan areas. I mean, this is a really long list, actually. This is only a couple of them. I'm not going to go through all of them. But yeah, it's like, ooh,
that's wild.
Not a great look.
I wonder how much actual like bacteria, is it like they measure in gallons in those canisters, or like how do they even? I wonder how much they actually released.
I don't know. The other thing is like how long did it take to grow all that? I mean, bacteria grows fast, but
like San Francisco's not huge, but it's not small either.
No.
And especially for it to like disperse over air.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's disturbing. It's disturbing on multiple levels. One, that the government would do something like that, but two, it also does prove the point of how easy it would be to cause a catastrophe,
Right.
And a pretty tough one to control. Like if someone really didn't care about the repercussions, used something like anthrax, a very, very toxic and deadly poison, which, we lived in an era where, 2000s, around that time, the terrorist attacks and things like that. That was a very real concern that was reemerging. The use of bioweapons and bioterrorism. So to think that you could do that at such a large level is kind of scary. But, I mean, that threat, by and large, is probably still there. I don't, again, know what more you could really do to mitigate it.
Right.
Of anything, that might be the scariest, potentially, one of, you have your more conventional weapons, sure.
Yeah, the nuclear bombs and stuff.
But this one is pretty scary because, a bioweapon is far less controllable. Interestingly enough, there was something I came across, and I don't remember the source, but it was like the discussion between why do we even have bioweapons, right? So technically they're illegal by Geneva Protocol, 1925, right? Post World War I, and that's been kind of supplemented over the years. In the 70s, there's another one. Even in the post 2000s, there's other add-ons. But that none of those really cause countries to refrain from, one, exploring it, researching it, developing it, or even stockpiling it. It's like, okay, why are you stockpiling something that you never intend to use, right? Like, you could say the same thing with nukes, but these are much more sinister in a way because you can't control it. If you throw a nuke at someone...
Yeah, they're not as much of a deterrent either.
No.
Like a biological weapon, I don't think people see those as deterrents.
No, they're pretty much just...
chaos.
Kill everything, And you see that with COVID. Like, presumably COVID, let's go say it was a lab leak. They couldn't control that.
No.
That's the kind of premise against gain of function is like, oh, you want to take something that's deadly and make it even more deadly? What happens when that gets out? you don't have an antidote, you don't have a treatment, you don't have a vaccine, everyone's screwed, doesn't make a lot of sense, you know. So there was an anecdote, though, that said that one of the reasonings why bioweapons persist as a mechanism of research for weaponry reasons is because you can put a number value of monetary sums on different kinds of weaponry. They said that like traditional bombings cost like, I don't know, $800 per cubic mile in terms of like damage to infrastructure and things like that. A nuke or even tactical nuke is like $600 or something like that. These sums are fairly arbitrary, I guess, but they said chemical weapons, it drops to like, I don't know, 400 or 500. They said in comparison to a biological weapon, the overall cost would only be like pennies on the dollar. And the reasoning is because when you drop a bomb or other large incendiary devices, yeah, you're causing death, which is bad, but you're also destroying all forms of infrastructure, buildings, roads, complete and utter chaos and devastation. You're basically making, and maybe even like radioactivity, you're making that area, not just killing it, the people in it, you're making it pretty much unusable.
Yeah.
With a biological agent, the assumption is that actually you're just ridding yourself of the people there and most of the infrastructure is retained, which is kind of a morbid thought, but it does make some sense.
I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I went down some deep, dark, really disturbing rabbit holes. You know, you would think that like bioweapons are a recent thing in human history. No.
Well, if they came about in like 1925, that Geneva thing, 1925, they had to have been around for, that's 100 years ago now.
I mean, technically, they're talking about using it back in like BCE, basically by like poisoning wells or throwing cadavers, diseased animals or people over walls to poison people with the Black Death, you know,
right. Yeah.
Things like that. You don't typically think as a bioweapon, but you're deliberately spreading disease to kill your adversary, or at least make their life harder.
I mean, that was probably like the first mass destruction.
Even like
mass destruction.
Smallpox blankets, you know, in the United States history, you know, dispersing that to rid of First Nations people. That was an example I saw. I was like, oh yeah, that's smallpox. You know, we still talk about that as a potential bioweapon.
Right.
So yeah, unfortunately, you know, science, as we've talked about often, can be used for good, can be used for bad. There should be, you know, you would like to think, restriction when the cost could outweigh the benefit, right? Which is like why gain of function is so terrifying. You know, what are you actually benefiting working on some of these bioagents or potentially infectious agents? That like, what are you learning that's so much more important?
I think it's a lot of like, well, if we don't do it, our enemies are.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And it's kind of the same vein as the nuclear buildup, right? Like, if not us, then they will, and they'll have an advantage.
It's the same with like AI or friggin' anything.
Pretty much, yeah. So it's like, regardless of the mechanism, we're spiraling into self-destruction, which is an existential crisis. So, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Bring it in with that wonderful knowledge of impending doom.
Well, this is somewhat of a shorter one, but an interesting one on the side, still science related, but more a story that you probably haven't heard of, because I've never heard of this one before. Yeah,
and like I said, I think it's a small example of a larger issue, one that obviously still I think is very relevant, if not now more than ever. I think, you know, you could probably do a whole book on this like lab leak COVID hypothesis. You know, truly a tragedy. If that's exactly what happened, it's almost unimaginable. But
probably get some release of documents 20 years from now.
I mean, probably not actually, but I think there's enough circumstantial evidence, like even just browsing this report by the committee, it's enough to be like, oh, that's suspicious. That's concerning. Why did it not get the attention, like, why did Operation Sea Spray not get the attention? I guess it did at the time. We weren't around, but I feel like these are really big things that should be on the front news of every newsstand. I guess we don't really have newsstands anymore, but
Google News.
No one's talking
Apple
about
News,
like the fact that if that were true and like there's good evidence to support it, that over 2 million Americans are dead, millions more worldwide, and probably tens of millions, myself included, have been afflicted by COVID in other ways, even without dying.
Negatively, yeah.
Right, and this is by and large, could have been a preventable, if not, should never even existed. That's a hard pill to swallow.
Well, yeah, it's come to, by now you kind of just know that whatever's in the news is probably not what you should be paying attention to. It's the stuff that doesn't. Unfortunately, the news isn't there to inform you.
Right.
You gotta really dig for.
And obviously, like, there's political implications,
right.
And that is obvious. I think that's one of the big reasons why you don't hear about it. It was politicized from the start. Anytime someone would bring that theory up, they called it, racist or crazy or just conspiratorial. But I think that's kind of part of the danger of the culture we live in, is that in lieu of actual scientific evidence, like I remember when COVID became COVID in the US, it was already going on in Asia and other parts of the world. There was a paper that came out of India, and I want to say it was like February or March of that year, 2020. We had just had our first official case. And it was out of my hometown, actually, in Washington. And this paper out of India had suggested that, this zoonotic transfer that they were claiming was very unlikely because there's parts of the DNA sequence of COVID that didn't seem to be in agreement with that kind of natural hierarchy, mutations and kind of like coming from a coronavirus, like that it didn't line up with what they would expect in modelings of how those change over time, to put it in layman's terms. And that paper came out, and about 2 weeks later it was retracted. You could still access it. I'm pretty sure I did it a year after the fact of the retraction. You could still access it, but it says retracted. And the question is, was it shoddy science? Was this a group trying to capitalize on something, or was it retracted for political pressures?
Right.
And I have reason to believe, and that's not probably the only paper that faced scrutiny and was kind of pulled or retracted.
No, I mean, I've heard of subsequent papers after that, and people talk about the different things that are part of the virus that don't really match up. I mean, unfortunately, we're not.
I'm not a virologist, but I read these papers, and this kind of speaks to a larger point that like not all science is good science, not all science can be believable, and we should always be skeptical. But completely hiding scientific potentials because of political narratives or other, reasons that aren't for just objective truth is it's censorship. It's a dangerous censorship that really I don't think has any true benefit to society other than for a very specific group of people that are trying to control narratives for whatever reason. And usually, again, get my tinfoil hat on here, usually I don't know that I have a lot of trust in those people. So
the cynic.
I mean, if sea spray doesn't do it to you, okay, look at that list again of other things. I mean, I could go find you some more probably, but anyway, so don't trust the government. Okay.
Appreciate you listening, and try to come out with one every week or so.
Yeah, let us know what you think about this, and if there's other topics in this kind of realm that would be intriguing to you.
All right. Take care, everybody.